This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good morning. It's now time for The Property Show with me, Keith Kam. Investing in properties overseas is becoming increasingly popular despite the weakening ringgit, mainly because of the long-term potential returns. There is still a possibility of making money from an increase in the property's value as well as from foreign exchange gains. Of course, things could go the other way too, but looking at historical data and what has been happening of late, the former might be more likely. Today, we will be speaking with Virata Tevasigamoni, spokesperson and head of the team of negotiators at Cornerstone International Properties. That's a real estate investment consultancy firm. Hi, Virata.
Hi Keith.
All right, Virata, first of all, CSI Properties. I like that name. Tell us a bit about yourselves.
Sure. Well, CSI Properties, or Cornerstone International, as you mentioned, is an investment consultancy. We focus in high-growth areas, particularly in Australia, UK, and Bangkok.
Right.
Yeah, so one of the main focuses we have is also in student properties. We probably have arguably the largest selection of UK student and residential properties, thanks to our partnerships there. One of our significant partners is Unite Group, which is UK's largest student accommodation provider.
So when it comes to property investments in general, what are some of the important things potential investors need to look out for?
Yeah, great question, Keith. I think especially when people are thinking about going abroad, really they think of it in Malaysia as well, but more so when they think of going abroad, financing, legal, and I think experience is key. When you think of financing, today there's a lot of challenges getting financing, particularly in Australia. So people who never considered the element of, bank financing and just waited to the last moment are finding lots of challenges. Some might even have to walk away from their deposits. And then, of course, on the legal side, if you think of that, laws are very different. You might be so used to how things are in Malaysia, but you can buy something in another country and all of a sudden even the state rules could be different. And of course, my final point in terms of experience, I think most of us can relate to, we've got an aunt or an uncle or so in Australia, UK. We often call them up and say, hey, what do you think about this and that or so on. I always take that with a grain of salt because, it's chatter. We always talk about properties. Everyone talks about it. Yeah. But going to a group that has a lot of experience in the industry, they can help you with the financing, with the legals, and really do a lot of due diligence, I think sets it apart.
First of all, financing,
yes.
We know that it's going to be a world of difference between Malaysia and, say, Australia and the UK.
Yes.
What are some of the challenges, the hurdles that people need to look out for, the major differences between, what we can get in Malaysia and elsewhere?
Sure. I mean, there's probably a lot of small changes here and there, but I think one of the significant things is that in Australia, for instance, again, if you're a Australian, you can buy any property. But as a foreigner, you can only buy new properties.
Right.
So if you try to buy a new property, then when it comes down to financing, today you'll find that the government of Australia is actually very, very risk averse. They've been concerned about fraud cases and so on. Right. So they've essentially almost pulled out lending. So as a Malaysian today, if you want to take financing in Australia, you have to go to international banks, Malaysian banks, Singaporean banks, and others. And they're not Australian banks, so they may not cover properties all across Australia. They might say, well, I'll just do Melbourne and Sydney because that's a big market and a lot of my clients need financing there. So if you just end up buying a property in Brisbane or Perth, you might be caught.
When it comes to legal issues as well,
Yes.
there's a world of difference between different countries. I mean,
Yes.
Take Australia, for example, as well. Foreigners are only allowed to buy certain types of property, but that's just one of the legal issues. What other legal issues should we consider?
Yeah, great one. I think in Australia, one of the safeguards, as much as Australia has a challenge with financing, it's probably one of the best protections in the world. In Australia, if you buy a property, your deposit is always 10%, goes into a lawyer's trust account. Those funds cannot actually be transferred to the developer. So unlike Malaysia, where we actually end up funding our developers, developers just take our money, take our bank financing and build the properties. In Australia, your deposit sits in a trust account. The developer gets their own financing. Only at the end of the day, when they've completed the property, do they ever get the single cent. So even when they pay agents commissions, they pull it out of their own pockets. So it's very secure in that sense, whereas Malaysia doesn't have that. No. UK, I think we've learned from the UK and our colonial ancestors in that sense. So in the UK, it's very much like Malaysia where anyone can contract into anything. And so a lot more due diligence is required.
From your experience
Yes.
with the clients that you guys have had, what are the common things that potential investors in foreign property, what do they most commonly overlook?
It's a great question. It's often something that we try to get clients to think about, but really it's not just overlooked. I think people tend to not even think about it at all. It's so basic. If I think with the first one is goals. Many people come to our events and they say, oh, I want to buy this property in Melbourne because my kid's going to university and so on. And they'll have an accommodation. 5 minutes later, you find out the kid's 5 years old. So
well, that's really planning ahead, right?
They are planning ahead, but they don't know for sure if the kid's really going to go to Melbourne to start with. But I think the differentiation that I'm trying to draw here is that it's very important to know, are we trying to buy a home to live in, or are we trying to invest in a property that gives you returns?
Right.
So I always tell my wife, if you want to buy a home, you take the lead. Whatever we like and it's great or so on, go for it. But if it's an investment, it's like stocks and bonds and so on. You don't need to really go into, how does this look? Is the sun rays coming in this way or so on? No, let's just go down to the numbers. And if the numbers perform and it's a solid investment, then it's great. So people overlook goals. I think the other thing is due diligence and track record. Everyone talks about it. It's thrown around so often, but what really goes into the track record and due diligence? We often go out to the UK, and some developers tell us that they see us at night coming back because we're actually counting the lights. Sometimes we're seeing how many rooms are really occupied. We're basically going out there, even doing anonymous calls to find out rental rates that they say and compare. You've got a lot of things that you can do in due diligence, but most people think due diligence, they go home, they call auntie and uncle, and that's it, right? So I think between due diligence and goals, that would be the two I really focus on.
Now, in the introduction earlier, I did say that investing in property overseas is... it could be a win or lose situation, but most actually think that it's really a good chance of making money. And from the way we've been looking at the performance of the ringgit, people tend to think it is a good investment. Is this a fact or a myth? It's a good investment.
Sure, no, it's a fair one, Keith. I think sometimes taking a logical approach to this. There's 196 countries around, right?
Yeah.
We're just one of them. I'd like to think, out of the 195 out there, there's got to be some sort of a better investment here and there. So I would say definitely it's a fact. But then again, like you mentioned, there are pitfalls as well. I mean, some people would say if you want the highest investment growth, maybe go to China, Vietnam, or maybe someone in Africa might have that as well. But perhaps the risk then is a lot higher as well. Then on the other side, you've got stable countries like the UK, Australia, US, Canada, and so on, where very stable growth. You don't expect to really lose. Of course, again, it's a long-term game. So it comes back to the exact project, property, and so on. But, I think there's definitely better deals out there.
But now when you talk about the UK and Australia, you talk about risk. They can't possibly be zero risk. Well, what are the risks that should you look out for?
Sure. I mean, there's no such thing as zero risk. Absolutely. So definitely not. Again, I think it comes back to sometimes the developer's track record. In Malaysia, a lot of people sometimes buy based on impulse. They go to an event, they see a discount of some sort, they buy. We don't think that's a great idea. Right? At the end of the day, you've got to look at the track record. In Malaysia, it's very easy. People say, I know SP Setio, I know these other groups, but you may not be as familiar with the groups out in a different country. So really doing your research, finding out the number of projects behind them and so on, I think is really important. I think, other things, of course, to look at is the laws in those areas as well. You might be so used to the fact that you do things over here, you take a lot of things for granted and you don't know just what you don't know.
Take us through what you see are differences between Malaysia's property investment landscape and, what you have seen so far overseas.
Okay, well, maybe start off from rental yields, right? In Malaysia, we're used to the fact that, I guess in KL, maybe you can get 4 or 5% rental yields, and that's decent or so. If you go out to places in the UK, major cities, you can get upwards of 8-9% in yields. And of course, some will say, wow, it's really that high, and question that back. But I would really question the Malaysian yields, because in Malaysia, most of us know about 1/3 of our properties in KLCC and Mont Kiara are empty. So even if you have 4.5% yield, most of the time you're not even renting it. It's on paper, and you can't even find a tenant. Right? Where in the UK and Australia, a 2 to 5% vacancy rate is very normal. In fact, when you get upwards of 5, people start worrying. They say, oh, it's a higher rate. But here we've got 35%, right? So that, of course, capital appreciation as well. UK and Australia is very stable. On average, in the last 10, 20, 50 years, it's always been about 7 to 10% growth per year. Malaysia, we always remember the good days.
Yeah.
The good days, we've got double-digit growth, 20%. Everyone screams about that. But when we have periods like today where there's really no growth, in fact, discounts are happening, people don't talk about it. No one likes to talk about losing money, right?
But where do you see local property investment going in this case?
Great question. I think we've had some bull years and we've done very well over the number of years. But today, clearly, affordability is an issue. Yeah. Every new condo coming out around the KL area is always RM1 million. Yeah. I don't know who can afford RM1 million. Certainly, most Malaysians can't. And we see a lot of foreigners coming in to buy. But again, when they're completed, I don't know how they're going to get it rented. Right? The rents are going to have to come down. So I'm not very optimistic. I think a lot of industry experts talk about how this year will be very much a buyer's market because the prices are coming down. Yeah. Discounts are just so prevalent. Yeah. Groups are even doing 20% rebates and so on, which is just crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot of offers going
absolutely.
Left, right, and center.
Yeah, there's a Chinese developer saying, buy a property in China and you'll get one free in Malaysia, right?
No. Anyway, we are speaking with Virata Tevasigamoni from Cornerstone International Properties on the Property Show this morning. In a few moments, we will discuss what is happening in the real estate market in the UK. BFM 89.9. We're back on the Property Show on BFM 89.9. We are with Virata Tevasigamoni from Cornerstone International Properties. Now let's focus on real estate investments in the UK. Now just recently, Rahim & Co.'s Executive Chairman, Tan Sri Abdul Rahim, he said this with regards to investing in UK properties.
There are a lot of Malaysians buying through us properties in the UK, especially in London. What we have found is that there is a decrease in Malaysians now buying into the UK market because of Brexit. There is a wait and see to see. Definitely, London property prices have gone down by about 10% as a result of the announcement of Brexit. But I think the market will find its level.
Okay, Virata, so last year we did see Brexit happen. The ringgit tanked, but actually so did the pound. How did this change the property investment landscape in the UK?
Well, I think Tan Sri is definitely, right in that sense that London has certainly felt the pinch, especially in commercial properties and residential in Zone 1 and Zone 2. If you go out further, the impact is less pronounced, especially if you go by the crossrails and where the locals live in. Regional cities, if you go outside of London, you go to places Reading, up north, Manchester and Liverpool, things are just going as usual. Right? In fact, the regional cities are performing way better than London. This past year, Manchester topped the list at about 9% growth, property growth. I think London was about 3.7 or so. So it's the first time London's taken a huge beating, and I guess we'll continue seeing that as Brexit unfolds.
Now, we've got companies like SP Setia and EcoWorld and together with our EPF involved in the Battersea Power Station. With the conditions that are going on right now in the UK, how do you see that project panning out?
Well, we always think of it with Brexit, there's a lot of fear. In fact, when Brexit was coming up last year, there was so much fear in the media. Everyone was talking about how, groups like these, YTL, other groups will be impacted. We were one of the few people out there saying, look, Brexit is great for Malaysians, even more so because the pound's going to plunge. And that's what happened and continues to happen, right? We all talk about the ringgit weakening, but the reality is the pound's taken a way bigger beating, right? It's the only currency today that, or I should say major currency, that Malaysians can take advantage of.
It's actually still status quo right now.
Well, last year, I should say 2015, it was up to 6.8.
Right.
Most of us will remember 2000s, it was always 6 to 7 ringgit to a pound.
Yeah.
Right. After the financial crisis in 2007, yes, it came down a bit to about the mid-5s or so on, but it came back up to 6.8 2015. Only because of Brexit and all the news that surrounded it, it just kept tanking. So the ringgit might have lost 20% of its value, but the pound's lost 30% against the US dollar. It's the only currency I would say that, you look at the numbers, you can take advantage of. So foreigners all around the world, not just us, the Chinese, the Singaporeans, the Middle Easterns, the Europeans, they're all taking advantage of the pound. So unfortunately for the Brits, they're feeling the pinch, but the rest of the world, they're seeing the UK, it's on sale. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it's a small window, right? It's not going to happen, for long. I think once the announcement comes in and officially makes it, Article 50 is triggered, The pound is expected to rise. Bank of America has talked about it. They've given advisory to all their clients saying that's the last time the pound's going to plunge. Get ready. You want to take advantage of that. Yeah.
Now, CSI is also in markets like Australia, Thailand, and even the UK. What are the differences in investing in these markets? I mean, currency strength aside.
Sure. Well, just very generally, of course, I could talk about an hour on this topic itself, but I think just to summarize it, if we think of three main areas, rental yields, capital appreciation, and the risk factor, yields in the UK are certainly one of the highest. They've got a major housing crisis. They're only building about 190,000 homes when they need 300,000. So the yields are very, very high. You're looking at about 7 to 9%. In fact, Manchester's average is about 8%. Whereas in Australia, you see very low yields, about 4.5%, 5% or so. Whereas Thailand is sort of in between, a bit moderate in that sense.
Right.
Property appreciation on the other side, UK and Australia are quite similar, where they're very stable, solid growth. 7 to 10% a year, every year for the last 10, 50 years or so on, is very, very strong.
Right.
It's not very volatile. Whereas Thailand's got a very strong growth in that sense this last few years. So it's maybe a bit like Malaysia, but they're a little behind. So Malaysia is tapering off, Thailand's sort of just picking at that speed. Risk-wise, I think everyone can guess this. UK and Australia, of course, very, very low, mature countries, very stable regulations and laws. Thailand's a little more of the Wild West in that sense. They're still quite regulated, but certainly not as highly regulated as the other two.
Earlier, you mentioned that CSI is quite focused on the student accommodation segment. What have you seen in terms of people investing in property for that purpose? Sure.
I think if you look at the industry itself, 2010, that industry was about £500 million going in terms of investment. Forward that 5 years, 2015, that industry went up tenfold to 6 billion, actually about 12-fold. Right? It's a massive investment going in. Institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds have focused tremendously in this market. Of course, our neighbors down in Singapore, GIC and Temasek, have taken a lot of opportunities here. In fact, they've announced a 227 million investment just recently as well. Personally, and I guess what I've seen within the organization itself is that while we focus on these three markets, UK has actually taken 60% of our volumes, right? Or I should say over 60%.
Wow.
And within UK itself, over 60% of that is student properties. Now, it's different, not so much because student is exciting or anything else. It's just down to one simple thing, return and risk, right? And with a very, very strong return and a low risk, it's just a no-brainer.
What particular cities are being focused on?
Great question. Now, student property, it's a completely different ball game altogether. It's not really about, population growth per se in the city. It's really more about student population growth in the cities. So when you think of Russell Group universities, which is your Ivy League type, that's where probably the strongest growth is happening. So places like Manchester, Liverpool, Southampton, York, Glasgow, these are among the more popular ones.
So I've read of reports which claim of returns of 8% net yield annually with 5 years rental assurance. It kind of sounds too good to be true.
Absolutely. Keith, I'm with you on that one. Generally, that's what most people think. In fact, before we got into this industry, it took us 2 years. We thought it was too good to be true. We went out there, we saw about 13 different groups, went out and did site inspections, looked through all these projects and so on. The reality is, this is a market norm. As I mentioned before, HSBC did a survey about rental yields, and Manchester came out at an average 8% yields across the whole city itself. When you look at the student accommodation market itself, it's very different from Malaysia, where sometimes we see some unscrupulous developers saying, I've got a GRR guaranteed scheme. All they've done is they've taken that rent, put it back into the property price, topped it up, and then sold it, right? And here in the UK, that's not the case. There's a huge housing crisis, more so in the student sector. So they're not doing that at all. In fact, most student developers will give a 3 to 5 year rental assurance. It's just the standard because they know they'll rent it.
Earlier we talked about financing and legal issues, but that was focused on Australia. What about in the UK? Are they very similar to us?
The UK side is similar in the sense that you don't have restrictions to buying new versus old or so on. And they don't have a challenge as the Australians do, whereby right now they're clamping down on foreign investors and loans and so on. It's very open. Anyone can get financing. The difference is that Malaysian banks and a lot of foreign banks tend to focus mostly on London. So traditionally, a lot of Malaysians invest in London because they can't get loans elsewhere. But today, a lot of international banks, Bank of China, most of the Standard Chartered and so on, they all look towards the whole country. So you can get financing. Student accommodation, though, often I've got to say our clients don't take financing. The ticket size is so affordable. It starts from about £50,000 or 250,000 ringgit. So for most clients, they think 8% return. I don't want to pay the bank. I don't want to share that. So they tend to buy cash. Yeah.
Finally, what's your advice to people? What sort of homework should they do before they embark on investing in property in the UK?
Well, there's a lot of homework to do. I think they've got to go out there and really understand the laws. They've got to understand the financing. They've got to not just rely on mum and pup and, auntie and uncle, me over there. So on. Of course, to shortcut the process, going out to consultancies like ourselves helps. But again, there's a lot of groups out there. People can just start saying, I'm involved in properties. You've got to ask them, what is it that you really do in due diligence? Ask them to show it to you because, we do tremendous research into companies, into financial reports. We search title. We check actually do the developers own the property themselves? And we can show that all to our clients. That's what our team's equipped to do. So I think, I always say this, dig behind the curtains, right? Don't just get caught up with a flashy brochure and a nice video.
We have been chatting with Virata Tevasigamoni from Cornerstone International Properties. Now, before we wrap up, here is a quick property tip. If you plan to rent out your property, whether it's to help you offset the mortgage or just for passive income, always make sure you have a signed tenancy agreement, which is then registered and duly stamped. Basically, the tenant needs to pay 3 months rental in advance, 2 months as a security deposit and 1 as advance rental, plus an additional deposit that is refundable for utilities. Check with a legal expert for the other details that need to be included in the tenancy agreement. Now, if you've missed any part of this program, download the BFM app on both Google Play and the App Store. That's all for this week's The Property Show. Join us again next week, Friday, after the 9:30 a.m. news for more. I'm Keith Kam for BFM 89.9.